She walked into a room, and the air changed. Not because she wanted it, but because she was simply there. Gia Carangi had that rare gravity, a face like a photograph you could never forget. Dark eyebrows, wide eyes, full lips, and a tilt of the head that looked like a secret. She didn't look like a model from a catalogue. She looked alive, unpredictable, and completely real. Gia was born in 1960 in Philadelphia, a city that could be both charming and cruel. Her home was broken early. Her father, a restaurant owner, left when she was young, and her mother's absence created an ache that never healed. Gia learned independence through loneliness. She became a girl who didn't beg for attention but pulled it in like a magnet. As a teenager, she was rebellious, unpredictable, already searching for something. Maybe love, maybe escape, maybe both. At 17, she moved to New York City with dreams too big to describe. She wanted to be seen. And New York saw her. A modeling scout spotted her in a small East Village bar, and within weeks she was signed to Wilhelmina Models, one of the biggest agencies in the country. The late 1970s fashion world was craving change. It was tired of perfect smiles and polished blondes. It wanted something real, something dangerous. Gia was exactly that. Her rise was instant. She appeared on magazine covers, walked runways, and shot with the biggest photographers in the world: Richard Avedon, Helmut Newton, Francesco Scavullo. They loved her because she didn't pose, she felt. Every photo had emotion, like she was confessing something to the camera. Her face carried contradictions, soft but powerful, confident yet fragile. The industry couldn't get enough. She wasn't a model trying to be famous. She was a girl turning her pain into art. The media started calling her the first supermodel. And in many ways, she was. Long before Naomi Campbell or Cindy Crawford, Gia embodied the idea that a model could be more than a mannequin. She could be a cultural force. She brought raw emotion into fashion, and people responded to it. She was rebellious, magnetic, untamed. Designers adored her. Photographers said she could transform a shoot just by walking in. But success arrived too fast. Behind the glamorous photo shoots and flashing lights, Gia was still the same girl from Philadelphia. Sensitive, craving love, easily hurt. Her relationship with Wilhelmina Cooper, her modeling agent and mentor, became one of the few steady things in her chaotic life. Wilhelmina believed in her, guided her, and protected her from the darker side of the industry. For Gia, who had already lost her father's presence, Wilhelmina was like family. New York in the late 70s was electric. Studio 54, rock stars, champagne, and danger. Fame made her a target for attention and excess. The fashion world praised her as rebellious, but also demanded control. Be thinner. Be calmer. Be perfect. The pressure was silent but constant. Everyone wanted a piece of Gia, her look, her energy, her story, but few wanted to know the real girl behind it. She began to experiment with the nightlife that surrounded her. The parties were endless, the temptations everywhere. At first, it was harmless fun, a drink, a line, a distraction. But beneath the glitter, something darker started to take root. Gia's friends noticed small changes: exhaustion in her eyes, slurred laughter, the way she'd vanish for hours. She was still showing up for shoots, still giving the camera her soul, but cracks had started to form. Yet even through the chaos, her magic never faded. On set, she was unpredictable but brilliant. Photographers said she could turn a simple shot into art just by looking into the lens. She brought truth into a world built on illusions. She was vulnerable and fearless at the same time, a rare, almost impossible combination. When she worked, she reminded everyone why they loved fashion in the first place. By the time she turned 20, Gia had everything most people spend a lifetime chasing: fame, money, beauty, and power. But she also carried an emptiness no amount of flashbulbs could fill. The world saw her as the ultimate fantasy, but inside, she was still the lonely girl from Philadelphia, misunderstood and searching for love that didn't come with conditions. Her story, at this point, looked like a dream. But dreams can turn fast. And for Gia, the same lights that made her glow would soon burn her. The same fame that lifted her up would start to destroy her. The cameras kept flashing, The world kept watching, and Gia kept smiling, but something inside her had already begun to fall apart. Fame doesn't always fade. Sometimes it breaks. For Gia Carangi, the cracks began quietly, right when she seemed unstoppable. The late 1970s had crowned her the face of a new generation, the rebel beauty, the girl who made fashion feel alive again. But when Wilhelmina Cooper, her mentor and one of the few people who truly cared for her, died of lung cancer in 1980, something inside Gia collapsed. Wilhelmina had been more than a manager. She was the only person who treated Gia like a human being instead of a commodity. Without her, Gia was alone in a world built on performance and pretense. Her modeling career didn't slow down immediately. In fact, it sped up. She was still on magazine covers, still in demand, but her eyes had changed. There was a sadness in them now, a kind of emptiness that even makeup couldn't hide. On photo shoots, she started arriving late or not showing up at all. Some days she was radiant, electric, other days she was unreachable. The agencies tried to control her, but Gia had stopped caring about control. The glamour that once felt intoxicating was now suffocating. New York's nightlife had its own rhythm, and Gia was swallowed by it. Studio 54 was her second home, a place where everyone was famous, high, and pretending to be fine. Cocaine, heroin, pills, they weren't shocking in that era, they were social. But Gia wasn't built for half measures. She chased feelings the way she chased love, all or nothing. Soon, heroin became her shadow. It was the only thing that made the noise stop. The only thing that made her feel warm when everything else turned cold. Friends began to worry. Photographers noticed her trembling hands during shoots. Makeup artists whispered about her scars. Some tried to help, others turned away. The industry doesn't pause for recovery, it replaces. And for Gia, replacements were already waiting. Younger, fresher faces, the next it girls of the early 80s. The supermodel era she helped create was now pushing her out. Fashion loves rebellion until it becomes inconvenient. The press began to change its tone. They still printed her photos, but the gossip grew louder. Rumors about drugs, fights, strange behavior. To the public, she was still the glamorous Gia Carangi, the beautiful rebel. But within the fashion world, her name started to mean trouble. One Vogue editor later admitted that Gia's unpredictability made her impossible to book. She'd disappear for days, come back apologetic, then vanish again. Her career wasn't falling, it was unraveling. But beneath all that chaos, there was still the same girl, sensitive, lonely, craving love. Gia never hid who she was. She was openly gay at a time when few dared to be. She didn't care about the whispers, she loved freely, fiercely. Her relationships were intense, passionate, and often painful. One of her most well-known romances was with makeup artist Sandy Linter, a love that burned fast and deep. Gia adored her, maybe too much. But fame and addiction don't make space for gentle love. The relationship collapsed under the weight of both. And when it did, Gia sank deeper into the only thing that didn't abandon her, the drugs. There's a famous photo from around this time, Gia lying half-naked against a wall, her face half in shadow. The beauty is still there, but it feels haunted. That picture became a metaphor for her life, half light, half darkness. She was still working, still appearing on runways and in magazines, but the sparkle had dulled. Photographers started cropping out her arms to hide the needle marks. Retouchers blurred away signs of pain. Fashion doesn't like reminders of reality, it wants fantasy. Gia was barely 21, but she looked older. Not in a bad way, in a tragic way. There was experience in her eyes that no one that young should have. She would show up to shoots with long sleeves in summer, sunglasses indoors, and a smile that never reached her eyes. Sometimes she'd disappear mid-session, and the team would find her hours later, staring into space, lost. The people around her talked about her in past tense while she was still in the room. And yet, every so often, the old Gia would flicker through. She'd laugh, crack a joke, pose like magic. For a few minutes, she was the girl who changed fashion. But it never lasted. The drugs had begun to control her completely. She tried to quit, a few times, even checking into rehab, but the cycle always pulled her back. Addiction isn't just about craving a substance, it's about craving silence when your thoughts won't stop screaming. The fashion industry, as always, moved on. Magazines that once fought to feature her stopped calling. Brands replaced her with newer faces. Gia's name became a whisper in the corners of casting rooms. Her agency dropped her. The same world that made her a star now pretended not to know her. She had gone from front row queen to backstage ghost. And the cruelest part? The audience never saw it happen. On the surface, Gia still looked like the picture of success, the beautiful girl in glossy ads. But behind those pages, she was falling apart. By the early 1980s, Gia's addiction was no longer a rumor. It was reality. She had burned through most of her money, lost many of her friends, and alienated almost everyone in the industry who once adored her. Still, some refused to give up. Photographers like Scavullo would give her one more chance, hoping the old Gia would return. But every time she tried to come back, the world seemed colder. Her spark was fading, and even she could feel it. Her story was shifting from fame to survival. The girl who once embodied beauty was now fighting demons no makeup could cover. The cameras still flashed, but they no longer celebrated her, they documented her slow disappearance. By 1982, Gia Carangi's name no longer glittered under the lights of New York. The girl who had once been the pulse of fashion was now a ghost haunting the very world that made her. Her face still appeared in a few last campaigns, but the energy, that wild, alive spark, was gone. What remained was a woman fighting for fragments of herself. Fame had left, but the pain stayed. Her addiction was no longer hidden. It followed her everywhere, into studios, onto sets, and into the stories people whispered behind closed doors. She had become unpredictable. Sometimes she'd show up late, her eyes unfocused, her words slurred. Other times, she was radiant, trying to prove she could still be the Gia everyone remembered. But the industry doesn't have patience for tragedy. Fashion runs on perfection and illusion, and Gia had become too real. The same people who once called her a muse now called her a problem. Her arms bore the marks of her struggle. Photographers learned to shoot around them. Long sleeves, strategic shadows, careful angles. They retouched the signs of her addiction, pretending nothing was wrong. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that beauty can break, that glamour has a cost. And no one in fashion wanted that truth. Still, there were moments of hope. Gia tried, again and again, to get clean. She entered rehab, promising herself that she would start over. For a few weeks, she did. She worked out, stayed sober, called old friends. But every time she stepped back into the city, temptation waited. Dealers knew her name. The clubs still played her favorite songs. And loneliness, that old wound from childhood, always came back stronger when the noise faded. Her relationship with her family grew complicated. Her mother wanted to help but didn't know how. Her old friends were torn between sympathy and exhaustion. The industry she had built her name in moved on without a glance. By 1983, Gia had disappeared from modeling almost entirely. The fashion magazines that once begged for her now acted as if she had never existed. Her absence wasn't even dramatic, it was silent, like she'd been erased. Those who saw her on the streets of New York barely recognized her. The girl who once lit up runways now looked fragile, worn, older than her years. Sometimes, she'd be seen wandering downtown, hoodie pulled up, trying to avoid the stares of people who once adored her. She wasn't running from fame, she was running from the version of herself that fame had created. But the strange thing about Gia is that she never stopped carrying a kind of beauty, even in her collapse. Photographers who caught glimpses of her said she still had those eyes, soft but fierce, defiant but lost. It's as if her pain gave her a new kind of magnetism. A different light, dimmer but more human. The kind of beauty that hurts to look at. In 1984, Gia tried to rebuild again. She reached out to old contacts, hoping for a fresh start. A few magazines gave her another chance. One of them was a cosmopolitan shoot by Scavullo, one of the photographers who had discovered her. It was supposed to be her comeback. But even that session had a shadow over it. Gia looked thinner, quieter. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. In the final photo, she looked ethereal, beautiful, but not present. It would become one of her last major shoots. As her addiction deepened, her world shrank. Modeling was gone, parties were gone, and her circle of friends had disappeared. She spent her nights drifting between apartments, dealers, and silence. The heroin dulled her pain, but it also dulled her soul. And yet, in rare moments, she would talk about wanting to live, wanting to love again, to start over somewhere far from the flashing cameras and cruel gossip. By 1985, her health was failing. She tried to get clean again, this time in a hospital program. She managed a few months of sobriety. For a moment, it looked like she might make it. She reconnected with her family, started talking about new work, even smiled in photos again. But life outside the hospital felt heavy. The world didn't feel forgiving. Every street corner reminded her of what she'd lost. That same year, she began showing symptoms doctors couldn't explain: fatigue, fever, infections. At first, no one understood what was happening. But soon the truth came out. Gia had contracted HIV from a contaminated needle. It was the early 1980s, when AIDS was still a mystery and a stigma. People whispered the word like a curse. For Gia, it was another kind of exile, this time not from fame, but from humanity. When news spread, the fashion world didn't react. There were no headlines, no sympathy. The same magazines that once celebrated her beauty now stayed silent. The modeling industry, terrified of the AIDS panic, distanced itself completely. Gia became invisible again, erased not by scandal but by fear. Her final years were quiet and lonely. She moved back to Philadelphia to live with her mother. Gone were the bright lights and flashing cameras. In their place were hospital visits, treatments that didn't work, and a silence that must have felt heavier than fame ever did. Yet even then, Gia tried to find moments of peace, listening to music, writing in her journal, sometimes smiling for the few who still came to see her. The world had moved on, but Gia's story wasn't over. It was about to become something else, not a tale of beauty, but a warning. A mirror held up to an industry that worships youth and discards broken angels. On November 18, 1986, Gia Carangi died in a hospital in Philadelphia. She was only 26 years old. No red carpets, no cameras, no farewell headlines. Just her mother by her bedside, holding her hand. The world that had once shouted her name had long gone silent. Fashion didn't write tributes. Magazines didn't publish her story. Her death passed almost unnoticed, a quiet ending for a woman who had once embodied everything loud, bold, and beautiful about her generation. But her story didn't die there. Gia's death marked a turning point, even if the world didn't realize it yet. She was one of the first famous women to die of AIDS-related complications. The disease was still whispered about, misunderstood, and feared. Gia's case broke the illusion that AIDS belonged only to certain groups or lifestyles. She was young, glamorous, adored, and suddenly, she was gone. Her passing forced the fashion world, however reluctantly, to confront its own fragility. In the years that followed, the industry tried to forget. It preferred stories of triumph, not tragedy. But Gia's shadow lingered. Photographers, stylists, and models who had worked with her couldn't shake her memory. They talked about her eyes, how they seemed to hold a lifetime of emotion, even when she was just a teenager. Some said that Gia wasn't destroyed by drugs, but by love, or rather, the lack of it. She had too much heart for a business that thrives on surfaces. Her mother, Kathleen, became her quiet archivist, preserving photos and memories so the world wouldn't erase her daughter completely. It wasn't until the late 1990s that Gia's story began to re-emerge, first through articles, then through the 1998 HBO film Gia starring Angelina Jolie. That movie brought her story back to life for a new generation. Jolie's raw performance, trembling, emotional, defiant, reminded audiences of the real woman behind the myth. It showed Gia as she truly was, brilliant, flawed, and human. After the movie's release, the world rediscovered Gia. Fashion retrospectives called her the first supermodel. Critics revisited her photos, seeing now what many had missed before, the honesty in her face, the way she seemed to feel everything too deeply. She became an icon not just of beauty, but of vulnerability. Gia represented something that the 1980s world wasn't ready to face, that perfection is an illusion, and the cost of chasing it can be deadly. Looking back, it's impossible not to see how far ahead of her time she was. Before Cindy Crawford, before Kate Moss, before the era of supermodels who ruled pop culture, there was Gia. She set the tone, the mix of danger and desire, of imperfection turned into art. Her influence can still be seen today, in the fashion editorials that value authenticity, in the models who refuse to fit into one mold, in the new generation of women who show their scars and still call it beauty. Gia was doing that long before it was safe to. But perhaps the most haunting part of her story isn't how she died, it's how she lived. She was brave enough to love women in a world that didn't accept it. Brave enough to stand out when the system wanted sameness. Brave enough to be real when everyone else was pretending. She broke rules, not because she wanted to rebel, but because she didn't know how to be fake. That's what made her powerful, and that's what made her fragile. If Gia had been born today, she might have survived. The world now talks about addiction, mental health, and loneliness with compassion, conversations that didn't exist in her time. Today, she might have found support, understanding, maybe even healing. But in the cold, glittering world of 1980s fashion, vulnerability was seen as weakness. So, she hid her pain behind the same face that made her famous. The camera saw the beauty, but never the ache behind it. Her death left questions that still echo decades later. How can someone so loved by millions feel so unloved? How can an industry built on beauty be so cruel to those who create it? Gia's life is more than a cautionary tale. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask who we celebrate and why we forget them when they break. Even now, her photos feel alive. You look at them and sense motion, emotion, truth. She wasn't posing, she was confessing. That's why people still remember her. That's why, even in death, she refuses to disappear. Gia's beauty wasn't in her perfection. It was in her chaos, her contradictions, her honesty. She showed the world that being real is more haunting, more magnetic, than being flawless. In the end, Gia Carangi was more than a model. She was a message, one the world was too blind to understand while she was alive. She showed us that fame doesn't heal loneliness, that beauty doesn't protect from pain, and that the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. Her story still hurts because it's still happening, in different faces, different eras, under the same unforgiving spotlight. So remember her not as the girl who fell, but as the woman who dared to be seen, completely, imperfectly, and without apology. Gia Carangi didn't just change fashion, she changed what beauty means. And even now, decades later, we're still trying to catch up to her truth. She was beautiful. She was wild. She was free. And for a brief, shining moment, she was everything the world wanted to be.